Hello everybody, and welcome to WriterSpeak, a program dedicated to the written word and those who produce it. My name is Elaine B. Holtz, and I'm your host. And I am so excited about today's show. I have a special guest with me by the name of Keith Kilburn. And Keith wrote a book called Flowers in Their Hair, which is all about his experience in the 60s. And I'm so excited about having him on the show. Keith, welcome to WriterSpeak.
Thank you, Elaine. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I mean, the book is fascinating, but before we get into the book, I'd like to tell our viewing audience just a little bit about you. Keith is a psychotherapist. Can I tell you some of my problems? No. Keith is a psychotherapist, and he's also a, what I would call a visionary. He's a married man. He's been married for 20 years. He has 6 children, and he has, how many grandchildren did you say you had? 9. 9 grandchildren, so he's a really busy, busy man. He's also a product of the 60s, which is really, really very interesting to me. You know, just talking a little bit about Keith, like I said, he's a psychotherapist. He's also a wilderness guide, and he takes people, what a wilderness guide is he takes people on vision quest. Along with that, and a practice, and being a grandfather and a good husband, he has taken time to write this book. So, you know, this is a real, very, very interesting book to me, especially the title, Flowers in Their Hair. I mean, I'm sure everybody remembers that song, If You're Going to San, right?
Yeah, that's where it came from.
That's where it came from. So, you know, I told our viewers a little bit about you, but is there anything else that you'd like to share that you think is important before we go into the book?
Well, I think that the book reflects, and what I have done in my life reflects that I really see life as a spiritual journey. And that's the aspect of the 60s that was most important to me.
Well, you know, Keith, it's really interesting when you say spiritual journey. You know, people get so many different ideas about that. Can you explain what did that mean to you at the time, spiritual journey?
Well, I probably had no concept of that up until I was about 21, and it was really LSD that opened our eyes to the fact that there was something called spirit, that there was another reality that was behind or more ultimate than this material reality. And it was a set of experiences at that time that said, well, this is a quest, this is a journey here, a journey of discovery. And we can't immediately define what it is. We can feel it, we can experience it, we can see it. And some of the models that came to us from Asia, from Buddhism, from Hinduism, from Native Americans and other indigenous people, helped us because they fit with what we were experiencing.
You know, that's interesting that you say that, because so many people think of the 60s as all these people freaking out, rather looking at the experience being a spiritual journey, drawing in from other cultures and other ways of finding yourself, so to speak, and then moving on with your life. That's really, really interesting. I mean, just the fact that we're able to talk about it today, you know, that we're still here to be able to communicate is very, very exciting to me. Talking about communication, what was the whole idea of when you wrote Flowers in Their Hair? We know where you got the title from. I mean, that was such a popular song. I lived in LA at the time, so everybody was singing that, and everybody was going to San Francisco. But tell our viewers a little bit about what are you trying to communicate in this book? What was your motivation at the beginning?
Well, I felt that what had happened in the 60s was particularly important for the direction that culture has subsequently taken, and that nothing that I had seen written, I may have missed some things, had really talked about, well, what was the experience of the average hippie in that era? We certainly have had biographies of some of the great people, and we know the stories of the Grateful Dead or Janis Joplin or Jimi Hendrix. But what about the people who didn't get famous? What about the people the thousands who were part of the be-ins, who were part of the peace marches? What was their experience, and how did that then translate into an ongoing orientation in life? Did the concerns for peace, for social justice, for spirituality continue? Was the seed that was planted then something that became part of American culture in general?
I think that's a really important point, and the reason I want to point that out is because oftentimes people have a different vision of what went on. They didn't realize that there was a lot of social unrest. People were questioning authority, and at the same time liberating themselves, being a lot freer. So I think it's important that that information comes forward, because in my mind, I think it would be sad to have lost it all, what we have all learned. I mean, I was part of that myself, so I could totally relate to you, how it changed your life and how it changed your perception. Well, listen, you know, when sitting down to write a novel, you know, it's a tedious job. I mean, it's not something that we just sit down and go, 5 minutes, it's done. What were some of the best aspects of writing it and some of the worst aspects for you, as far as getting into the story and getting into what you wanted to communicate?
Well, really, both the best and the worst were what came up in the story itself, because inevitably when I began writing this, there were a lot of personal memories that entered into the formation of the story. And some of those were quite glorious and magnificent and joyous, and some of them were very painful. You know, I think everyone from that era remembers exactly where they were when they heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. That singular event right at the beginning of the era put a certain kind of dark cloud on things. That was then followed by the Vietnam War that went on for an entire decade, from 63 to 73 really. And so a lot of the, I would even say, desperation in trying to find an answer, trying to find a way to live, had to do with the very serious and negative challenges that we were facing.
You know, one of the things I love about your book, which I think is very, very, very interesting to me, is the fact that at the beginning of a lot of the chapters, you quote from different songs and different, you know, different ideas that were going on at that time. And you know, in talking about the Vietnam War and what was going on and how so much upheaval at that time, I was looking in the book, and you have this, it's called, the chapter is called Feeling a Draft, which I thought was very, you know, feeling it, because a lot of young men, particularly at that time, women were not quite going like they are today. Mm-hmm. But at that time, there was so much chaos and so much, you know, people burning their draft cards, etc. But let me just read this a little bit. This is from Country Joe and the Fish. Mm-hmm. And he says, "Come on, all you big, strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. He's got himself in a terrible jam way down under in Vietnam." You know, and that feels like that was kind of the mood at that time. Well, how old were you when that was taking place? Do you remember?
Well, I was, you know, right at draft age. I turned 18 in 1963. And so as the war heated up, I was one of those facing a lottery number, facing being called up, and there seemed to be a very early awareness that this war was not like other wars, that the perception by many of us as early as 63, 64 was, you know, we're the bully, we're the aggressor. We're the ones going and attacking a small country that only wants their own self-determination. And that this was a 180, a total turnaround from where we had been, for instance, in World War II, where most everyone would acknowledge, you know, we were on the side of justice and right and so on.
I think, you know, another point when you made about the Kennedy assassination, I think together with the Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam War, and then LSD coming on and the whole hippie generation coming on, there was so much thinking and so much, you know, letting go of ego and letting go of things and moving on. And there were so many people around that were inspiring us. You know, besides your own personal experience of, you know, fearing being drafted, which I know my brother was. I mean, my mother was beside herself.
Oh, yeah.
But who were some, in that era, at that time, and even now, who were some of the people that inspired you, that helped you to write the book? And another question, as you talk about the inspiration, is I noticed there's a person, a character, by the name of Zane, Z-A-N-E, in your book, which I think, to me, as I was reading it, I thought, is Zane Keith, or it's just a fantasy, you know, kind of your alter ego? So if you could answer those two questions, your inspiration and how Zane came out of your inspiration.
Well, you know, my initial inspiration really went back to being a teenager in the San Joaquin Valley and stumbling across the beat writers in the local bookstore.
Like Jack Kerouac? Oh,
there was Kerouac, there was Ginsberg, there was Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and they were an incredible inspiration to me. They were like a breath of fresh air.
I actually met Allen Ginsberg in person. Go ahead.
Yes, and I did as well subsequently, also Ferlinghetti. I never did meet Kerouac. He was a little more of a recluse. But there was a joie de vivre, a joy of life that came through in spite of living in the 50s. And, you know, the 50s were a very conformist, very held down generation. And here were the beatniks kind of striking a blow for human freedom. On the Road was an incredibly influential book, whatever we think about it now. You know, it was a couple of crazy guys driving across country. That's really about all it was about. But somehow it constellated a feeling of, let's just do it. Let's go have some fun. Let's not follow the rules and you know, line up and do what's expected. You know, let's do what we feel like doing.
Exactly.
You know, if it feels good, do it, became one of the mottos of the generation. And so, you know, in formulating this main character of Zane, I obviously relied a lot on my own experience to put that together. And I think I chose the name because to me it was such a Western name. Still to this day not a popular name. And who do we think of when we say Zane? Well, Zane Grey, who wrote probably 50 Westerns back in the 19th century.
Well, you know, Zane, as I read Zane, he was a very, very interesting character because he went through so many moods. You know, he's traveling, he's falling in love, you know, he's hitting all of life's, how can I say it, all of life's adventures. Would you agree with that? That he was kind of on an adventure towards living and towards learning more about life?
Yeah, and he participated and was involved in all of the major themes of the era, from the spiritual quest to the anti-establishment, anti-war political activity, to the peace, love, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the cliches that we still associate with the era. That was part of his experience as well. The nomadism, the, hey, let's just take off right now. Let's leave tomorrow and go somewhere. New York, Mexico, Arizona, it really doesn't matter, just as long as we're moving and having fun. Again,
you know, when we look at, it looks like Zane has a little experience where he ends up going to jail for a little while. And the chapter is called Locked Up. Let the midnight special shine its light on me. So it sounds like that's kind of what he was doing. He was just taking a ride and letting his light come through and just going on with the experience. Would you say that was true?
Yeah, and you know, as I have formulated him as a character, he's relatively lucky because I did know people in that era who were perfectly nice people who ended up in federal prison, either because of their anti-war activities or because of their involvement in the drug trade. And those were, you know, some of the disaster stories. I mean, we all know about David Harris, who was married to Joan Baez, who spent 3 years in federal prison for resisting the draft. And there were people who were often saying, I will choose prison over the army. That was very definitely articulated. Because the drugs were illegal, there was always the risk. That was another shadow that was always in the back of everyone's mind of, well, as much as we're just like, let it all hang out, another one of the mottos, there was this sense of, well, but the police can show up at any time and take us away for what we're doing.
I know, it was a very interesting time, and I think what I found important about the book, and excuse me, important about Zane's character, it gives us a deeper view of what was going on in the minds of young people then. Because oftentimes there's such harsh judgments like, oh, if you're protesting, it's unpatriotic. And at that time, it was, when I look back, I was also a student during that time. And when I look back on it, excuse me, it seemed like at that era, the most patriotic thing that we could have done was to stand up and say no more. So, and you're right. And so Zane goes to jail. And he, what was that feeling for him? I mean, explain it, because I read parts of the book, but you know, there was just such a deep feeling about his character that he was just trying to discover something, trying to hold on to something.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at the deepest level, you know, most of us had seen judgment at Nuremberg. It had been deeply embedded in our minds that there was such a thing as war crimes. It had been deeply embedded in our minds that following orders was not a defense. That if we felt that something was wrong, was unjust, was against the decency of humanity, it was our responsibility to stand up, and we could be held liable. And that was the deepest level of this commitment to say, no, hell no, we won't go. We're not going to be involved in this massive slaughter going on across the world in our names. You know, they're not going to do it in our names. You know, did we expect that there would someday be something like Nuremberg that would come up around this? Who knew? But the lesson had been learned you know, once that was established, you can't go back on it.
Well, you know, I just want to let my viewers just give a little oversight. The Nuremberg trials were after World War II, and it was when they tried several Nazis in Germany for war crimes. It was actually the first time that war crimes came up, and not only war crimes come up, but the idea that following orders was not an excuse anymore.
That's right.
And so now we come into Vietnam, which so many people were against. I mean, even Walter Cronkite, for heaven's sakes, came out trying to warn the country. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of chaos. So he seems to, it feels like when he went to jail, it was almost, he was proud of it. I mean, he felt that he was accomplishing something. And then he moves on when he gets out, and then suddenly you find him meeting other people, finding, you know, love and working into relationships. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Well, really, part of it was we had thrown out the role models. We felt like we could not trust the previous generations because they were the ones leading us down this primrose
Nobody
path.
Over 30, if you remember
That's
that
right.
one.
Oh yeah, exactly. And so it was trial and error. We were figuring it out as we went along. We were, let's try this. Oh, that didn't work so well. Well, what else can we try? And it was that way in terms of relationships, that we didn't want to do what our parents had done. We didn't want to follow that model that seemed to end up in a mediocrity at best, and certainly not a joyous sense of connection with another human being. And so a lot of the experiments failed. You know, it was basic science in a certain way where you just try something and you go, well, that didn't work. Next.
Well, it's interesting because, again, through the book, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about experimentation. You're talking about people allowing themselves to get into situations that maybe were unfamiliar and that they were willing to work with. And then again, when you're saying, did we make it? Did we fail? Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Which leads me to my next question, which is, here it is, what, 40 or 50 years ago that all this happened,
right.
And now you're writing this book. So I'm curious, is what was your intention, you know, and how do you see what happened in the 60s in relation to this book continuing on in today's world?
Well, my conclusion about the 60s was that the most important part was a sense of some type of spiritual commitment, and that could be anything, that it certainly involved practice. And I've been a daily meditator, for instance, since 1972. I've been practicing Tai Chi since 1974. It's part of my foundation. You know, I subsequently got involved in some Native American practices. Well, all of this was opened up in the 60s. You know, the doors were open and we got a chance to look into that world and go, oh, yoga might have some value. Well, obviously it did. We've got a yoga studio in every strip mall in the United States now. That wasn't true. You know, in the 60s, yoga was this weird stuff from India that a few of us were doing. And now everybody's doing it. So
it's the same thing, you know, people forget about recycling. Even recycling, I remember my mother coming in and saying, what's all that trash in the kitchen? I'm saying, I'm recycling. She said, oh my God, you're one of those hippies.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, exactly. You know, the Whole Earth Catalog,
oh, right.
you know, started back then. Stuart Brand and that whole group, it was the beginning of the ecology movement. And we don't usually associate ecology with the 60s, but again, the seed was planted in that era, and it's developed.
Organics.
Yeah.
What about organics?
Yeah, grow your own garden.
Right.
Back to the land was the real impulse. I mean, so many people, and it's in the book, did these country commune experiments, some of which are still going. They've been active, intentional communities for 50 years now.
Well, also, I think the whole, you know, the whole movement towards loving yourself, you know, learning how to, you know, to go deep within, to understand who you were. You know, you're a psychotherapist. You know, psychotherapy became very, very important.
Yes.
More and more people were trying to find out who they were. So it's really, the book is very timely in my mind, in a way that it brings us to the past. But it also educates us to how the past influenced today. And when you look at today's world, people are still seeking. I feel they're seeking more now than even back then. And oftentimes, what is such a mystery to me, and why I find this book to be so important, is that you see film or you see documentaries about the 60s where it just looks like they're all party animals. It doesn't appear that they have all the insight and all the experiments. Like you said, you know, hey, did we fail? Did we make it? But who knows? But certainly a lot of stuff was going on. Mm-hmm. So it's a valuable, I think it's a very valuable piece of work. Well, now, as we're kind of winding down a little bit on the show here, are you writing a sequel, or what else are you doing in relation to living in the 60s and that modality versus, is there going to be a sequel to this?
Well, yes. I'm in the middle of my second novel, and it's actually covering the era from the mid-'80s up to present time. And what I'm looking at with the characters in this book is that they are all children of the 60s, or most of them are. And what did they do with this impulse? What did they do with these seeds that were planted? How did it become more formalized, more consistent, more of a daily practice, more something that you could take and say, hey, we've developed this system and it really works pretty well. Why don't you try it? And this was the impulse that really began in the 70s. which is when I first got involved in studying psychology, and has continued that, okay, so we found some things that had value, but they were all like samples. We just got samples, and we had to decide to pick a few of them and really pursue them and go deep with that. And so the main character in the second novel has taken a few of those things and really run with them.
You know, it's interesting that you say that we took these little samples. At the time, when I was at that era, going to college, I was a single parent at the time, and I met a gentleman by the name of Reverend Thompson, and he was from, I believe it was Sign to the Mind, and I told him about the experience I had and everything, and he said, you know, Elaine, you got on a train and you went on this trip, and you stopped at all these different stations, and now you have to go back and figure out what was it that each station taught you and see how you can integrate it into your life. Well, you know, we're kind of coming to the end of the show, and you know, because this is WriterSpeak, and I know there are many, many writers out there that are, you know, trying to write their novel or have the fantasy of it. Can you give us a little tip or something that, you know, how is it that you were able to, number one, complete the book? I mean, I'm just so impressed, you know, when I see a book that's not only complete, it has a beautiful cover, the whole 9 yards, and now you're going into your second novel. What hint would you give writers that are watching the show here?
Well, it's a word that I used to hate. Discipline. Oh. And that just means consistency of effort, really. I have set aside a time each week to write. And I sit down at the computer and I write. And sometimes it's difficult and sometimes it's easy. But either way, I do it anyway. And someone gave me the advice, don't worry when you're writing, just write. You know, think of it as a first draft. You can go back, you can change things, you can revise, you can make it better, but get that first draft down, because that's the skeleton, that's the structure of your story. And don't judge yourself or criticize yourself too much when you're doing that part of it.
Well, Keith Kilburn, I want to thank you so much for being on WriterSpeak. And to my viewers, I highly recommend the book. I would like to hold it up. It's called Flowers in Their Hair, and it definitely gives a good picture of what was happening back then and the struggles of people who actually were living in this era. Well, anyway, our guest today was Keith Kilburn, who wrote the book, Flowers in Their Hair. I want to thank him again. And to my viewers, I want to thank you for watching. You've been watching WriterSpeak. I'm your host, Elaine B. Holtz, and hopefully you'll join me the next time.